I'm Sarah Posner, and this is The Posner Show. And my guest today is Denny Burk. He's a professor at Boyce College, which is an arm of Southern Seminary, which is the flagship seminary of the Southern Baptist Convention. And it is a little over 4 hours since the Supreme Court issued its decisions in the Proposition 8 and DOMA cases, and that's what we're going to be discussing today, hopefully with enough coffee and sleep and all of that good stuff. So let's start with the DOMA case. That was the first case that the Supreme Court issued this morning. And the court held over several kind of vociferous dissents by three of the justices writing separately. The court held that as applied federally, DOMA is unconstitutional. So that means that it was not before the court, and the court did not address the application of DOMA at the state level. So, for example, whether North Carolina, which does not recognize same-sex marriage, has to recognize a same-sex marriage from Maryland, a state that does. So that was not the issue before the court. The issue before the court was whether it was unconstitutional vis-a-vis federal benefits for married same-sex couples, like Social Security benefits and veterans benefits and the tax consequences. The case before the court was actually involved the application of the estate tax to the widow in a same-sex marriage. So, what was your reaction to, I think I can guess basically what your reaction was to the decision, but why don't you discuss a little bit what you thought after reading. I assume you read the majority and the dissenting opinions.
I was surprised today. I really thought that there was more potential for the sweeping opinion to come on the Proposition 8 case, but really it happened with the DOMA case, and I was surprised by that. I don't think there's any other way to take this except that we've just seen a signal day in the history of the United States. I think that this you have a few days in the history of the United States which are really important judicially and that stand out. You can name some famous cases. I think today's going to be one of those days. This DOMA case does not establish a right to same-sex marriage for all 50 states. It doesn't do that today. But it brings us, I think, right up to the brink. I think it lays the legal groundwork so that we're just one test case away from having a constitutionally based right to gay marriage. That's what I think.
Well, the court, obviously the court did not rule on the constitutionality of same-sex marriage, either ballot measures or laws passed by state legislatures. That could have been the issue before it in the Proposition 8 case, but it declined to hear it on standing grounds, basically ruling that because government officials did not defend the Proposition 8 in court, and it was basically citizens who had promoted the ballot measure in California who were defending it in court, that there was no standing for them to hear the case. And that was also a split decision, 5-4, and not split like the DOMA decision was along ideological lines. There was a little bit more of a mix on both sides. And that decision on the standing issue, I was a little bit. I thought that the dissent had some persuasive arguments on the standing issue there, but that direct on issue was not addressed, and I think that, obviously I did not read the whole range of opinion on the opinions, but it seemed to me that there's still a lot of work to do from the standpoint of same-sex marriage proponents to have same-sex marriage legalized across the board. It doesn't seem as maybe inevitable or easy path.
Yeah, I'm no lawyer, and as I've been looking at the Proposition 8 result, it's not at all clear to me what this is going to be. Initially the reports have been that, well, at least gay marriage is going to be legal in California now. But then there's some other authorities on the other side saying that may not be the case. This may not have an effect beyond the plaintiffs in the original case. If that's the case, then it may not be a sweeping ruling even for California. my hunch is that the bureaucrats who dispense marriage license in California are not going to wait for that to be adjudicated. They'll probably start handing them out immediately. But that's just a hunch.
I think the governor of California said something to that
Yeah,
effect.
so I think that that's probably what's going to happen there, but it's going to be vigorously challenged. So that's not settled yet, but that's going to be something that's adjudicated here in California courts.
So, but I guess, hasn't it already been adjudicated? That's what I guess I don't understand. So they're reverting back to the district court opinion when the government officials were involved in defending it, and basically letting that stand. The decision that invalidated Proposition 8, which was the ballot measure that the voters...
Right, and it may very well be the case.
2008.
Yeah, it may very well be the case that that's how the legal authorities read it. And if that's the case, then same-sex marriage will commence in California as it did before Proposition 8. But there are some people who are disputing whether or not it's going to have an effect beyond the plaintiffs. And if you're asking me to untangle California law and how that's going to work out, I don't know.
Right.
But it seems to be a little bit
that.
less of a slam dunk than what was initially thought.
Interesting. So let's return to the DOMA case, which has applicability, obviously, in all 50 states, even though it's dealing with the federal aspect of the law. What was I thought it was very interesting, Kennedy's majority opinion, and I wrote about this morning, Kennedy's majority opinion, and then the dissenters' reaction to it. So he was basically saying, look, you can't say that you're legislating this on the basis of some concept of morality when it impinges on the rights of other people. So he was basically saying that, looking at the legislative history of DOMA and the justifications for it, as lawmakers advocated for it, and basically saying that wasn't a reason, it wasn't a justifiable reason for infringing on the constitutional rights of the people affected by it. But the dissenting justices were very vociferously reacting to that particular part of Kennedy's opinion and accusing him of accusing other people of bigotry and so on. I'm interested in your reaction to it.
Yeah, Roberts said in his dissenting opinion that he wouldn't want to paint the branches of government with this broad brush of bigotry, which is the way that he viewed what Kennedy said. Because Kennedy made numerous statements to the effect that both the president who signed the bill into law and the Congress that passed DOMA, that it was only passed in order to disparage and to injure same-sex couples. That it was meant to, and it uses the word demean, and to impose inequality, to impose a stigma, to deny people equal dignity. These are the words that the majority used when, for me, I think the majority just got it wrong. I think the Supreme Court got this wrong. It was never in the intent of either President Bill Clinton or the Congress at that time to demean or deprive anyone of basic human rights. It seems to me the majority imputes a motive to President Clinton and to the Congress that they never would have recognized. And you would have to say, if you say that of the President and Congress in 1996 when they passed it, you have to apply those terms to anybody that holds to a traditional view of marriage based on a moral or religious consideration.
Well, that's what I was thinking as I was reading the opinion. I actually thought that was extremely telling of where the Supreme Court may be going on these issues and where it might have gone if it had decided Proposition 8 on the merits, if it had gotten past the standing issue there. And I thought it was pretty remarkable. I wasn't expecting them to go there. And it was, basically saying you can't use your religious views to infringe on the constitutional rights of other citizens. And I don't know that he accused people of bigotry, but just basically making the argument that, you really can't use that as a reason for passing legislation.
Yeah, it wasn't just religious views. He says you can't base it on a moral judgment, whether that's rooted in religion or not, which was really ironic because when you read his opinion, he is making a moral judgment. You know, he's saying that it's wrong for people to base laws on a moral judgment. So it's inherently self-contradictory, I think, in that respect. But it's not unconstitutional to have laws that are based on moral judgments. I don't know where he's getting that from or what constitutional basis there is for saying that. You can have moral... Well, you can have a moral base. In fact, I would argue I can't think of a single law that doesn't have a moral basis to it, rooted in someone's moral tradition. The question is whose moral tradition is going to win out in the public debate, and the court shuts down that debate instead of letting the people decide.
Well, it's entangled also with other people's interests that get swept up in these moral judgments, and so I think that's what Kennedy was getting at. But I mean, were you surprised that to read the opinion and that it had that particular stance to it? I mean,
yeah, I was.
I was surprised because I just wasn't really. I was expecting more of a what's the word I'm looking for? I was expecting more of a dispassionate constitutional argument from somebody like Kennedy, and I obviously I didn't know before this morning that Kennedy would be writing the majority opinion, but I wasn't expecting the court to really take aim at that view, which is shared by obviously shared by Democrats and Republicans, but mostly Republicans who oppose same-sex marriage. But I wasn't really expecting him to take aim at it in that particular way.
I wasn't either. I think it has broader implications, though, because now you have the Supreme Court on record basically saying, well, it treats those with a traditional view of marriage with the same, it puts them in the same moral category as racists, really. It doesn't, without saying it in so many words, that's what it does. And so you've got a moral approbation from the Supreme Court that's going to have wide-ranging implications. And you know, you and I had a discussion last November about some of these issues.
Right.
And I told you back then that I thought, you know, today could be the day that same-sex marriage becomes the law of the land. We're not there yet. I think we're right at the edge of it. I think that we're one legal challenge away from that happening at this point because of the decision today. But we're very close to it. We're very close to it. And I also told you last November in that interview that the concern that you're going to hear more and more from Christians, and frankly my concern right now as a Christian, is the religious liberty implications of all of this. Because the Supreme Court has gone on the record, it really puts any traditional Christian, Muslim, Jew, it puts us sort of in a box and at odds institutionally with what's considered to be in bounds now. So I don't think we've begun to imagine what the implications of this are going to be. And so I think today is momentous. I've heard this compared, you know, is this the Roe v. Wade of gay marriage? I think it's more apt to compare it to Roe and Doe put together. Roe v. Wade establishes a pretty, you know, abortion on demand in connection with Doe. I think that the Windsor case today, in connection with whatever that next challenge is going to be, that's going to be what establishes the constitutional right for gay marriage. So we are, as Scalia said in his dissent, we're waiting for that other shoe to drop.
I wonder, though, I mean, there are a lot of other contexts for religious liberty arguments, and when something infringes on somebody's religious liberty, and that wasn't something that was raised in this case. The court did not address that issue in this case. It wasn't before it. And so, I mean, I just wonder if, you know, it's not the end of the line for someone who wants to make a religious liberty argument. I'm not saying that they would win a religious liberty argument, but I'm just saying that because the court hasn't really, it didn't address that in this context, whether that would be something that could be before the court in a future case.
I think it will be. And what you're going to see from people who are concerned about traditional marriage, not just Christians, is you're going to see a desire to test these results early and vigorously and on religious liberty grounds, because once ground is taken, it's hard, it's very difficult to get it back. So you're just going to see challenges to this as we go forward. Now, today, as I said, today doesn't establish gay marriage in all 50 states. It's that next shoe that drops. And so when that drops, you're going to start seeing challenges. I mean, I think we've already seen, just if you're paying attention to what's going on across the country, in states that do have gay marriage or that do have laws defining homosexuals and transgender people, for instance, as a protected class, you do see challenges going on, state constitutional and federal constitutional challenges to those laws. Well, you can imagine what's going to open up if we have, because of the Supreme Court, a federally defined right to gay marriage. So I think those tests are forthcoming, and they'll be important.
So do you foresee someone challenging a law that was either passed by a state legislature or passed at the ballot box, like Prop 8 was, or sort of the reverse of that, a same-sex marriage ballot measure passing? Do you see somebody challenging that on religious liberty grounds? I mean, do you think that that's the direction that the challenges are going to go in?
I do. Well, because these aren't going to be imaginary things. They're going to be real issues in people's lives where they're going to have an objection to some situation that requires them legally to recognize a gay marriage as an actual marriage, and it's going to be in conflict with their conscience, their views morally, or their views religiously, and that's going to be then it becomes a First Amendment issue. And so that's where you're going to see the challenges. We've seen the cases with the bakers and the photographers, the people who own the bed and breakfast, but that's just the tip of the iceberg of things that could possibly be come up.
So what do you think? What do you think is beyond the iceberg?
Well, it's not those cases mainly had to do with the baker and the flower shop had to do with participating in a wedding. But what are you going to do with employers who, for I don't know whatever reason, might be required by the state to regard an employee's union as a marriage, but they are objecting to that, or they don't agree with that, or they feel that in their conscience they can't acknowledge what the state is saying they must acknowledge as a marriage. That would have implications in the workplace immediately.
So you're saying
you would have
an employer who doesn't want to provide health insurance coverage to a same-sex spouse or something of that nature?
Yeah, and I'm not even saying that would necessarily be the universal response of religious people. I'm throwing that out. There's a possibility that one person may think that. I mean, more concretely, you think about like we've already seen in Massachusetts with Catholic Charities having to leave the state because they didn't want to provide adoption services to same-sex couples. Well, they're a Roman Catholic group, and so they either had to conform to the Massachusetts requirement that they provide to all couples, including same-sex couples, or they had to stop. Well, they just had to stop and get out. And so, it's one thing to get out of Massachusetts and maybe you can, put up a shingle somewhere else, but what are you going to do as gay marriage sweeps across the nation and there's nowhere else to go?
Well, it's interesting. I think that we might get some hints of the way the Supreme Court would rule on that First Amendment issue from the cases challenging the Health and Human Services contraception coverage requirement that are making their way through the courts and will probably reach the Supreme Court at some point. And those obviously don't address it's not the same precise issue, but it is being framed as a religious liberty issue and a question of the employers are raising the question of can the government make me do this when I say it violates my religious freedom? And so we might get some preview, perhaps, before one of these marriage cases reaches the court, of how the court views those sorts of controversies.
Right, and it's up in the air. And so if you can imagine a person who holds to the sanctity of human life at all stages, or a person who holds to traditional marriage, you sort of see at this moment that you don't know what the future holds. You don't know whether or not you'll be able, if there's going to be some repercussions for holding to what your most deeply held beliefs. So, like I say, a lot of these things are going to have to be adjudicated, but it's going to be difficult days. I'm not hopeless as a Christian believer. I'm not hopeless. I mean, Christianity has thrived in all kinds of cultures, whether it was friendly to the basic tenets of the faith or whether it was unfriendly. So I'm not hopeless about the fortunes of Christianity because of all of this. But I am saying that it could portend some difficult times and for the squeeze to come upon us in very real ways.
So there are, maybe 30 states that have, I think there's only a handful of states left that do not have any law on their books on marriage. So there's 9 now that legalized same-sex marriage, and then there's a whole slew of them that, around between 2004 and 2008 roughly, passed measures or constitutional amendments defining marriage as being between a man and a woman. Right. It seems to me that those would be very hard to undo, just legally and politically speaking. And so it seems to me that we're those are with us to stay at least for a while, or until the Supreme Court rules that they're unconstitutional.
Yeah, I mean, how long? I guess how long will it take, for a person, say a lesbian couple in Albany who are married, to travel down to my home state, Louisiana, and they get there and they want their same-sex marriage recognized in terms of maybe some federal benefits or something. Well, it was recognized in New York, and now it's not going to be recognized in Louisiana. And so they'll have, because of Windsor, they'll have a basis upon which to sue. And to say that...
Right, that's the other part of DOMA that the court didn't address today.
That's right, but
whether the states have to recognize each other's rules or laws on same-sex marriage. And so, yeah, it seems to me that probably is the next challenge to DOMA, at least.
But I don't see that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess legally speaking, there's different ways that could come out in terms of how, if the court were to rule that it's unconstitutional for Louisiana to not recognize a New York marriage, it still might not get to the specific issue of whether the state itself can legislate against same-sex marriage. I think there's a long way to go till it gets all sorted out.
Yeah. Well, I had one legal friend today say he thinks it could be within the next 10 years, and I'm thinking, I don't see same-sex marriage proponents waiting for 10 years or even 2 years. I see them probably trying to find a test case tomorrow, and so within the next year we'll probably see several attempts at a test case that hopefully would make it up to the Supreme Court. So, I think that this is going to happen. It's just a matter of when. My guess is sooner than later, because the proponents are feeling the winds at their backs.
So, how do you? You're obviously not. You're a professor and a theologian. You're not a politician. But I'm sure you're an observer of politics. Do you think that this is a potent issue for politicians? I think we talked the last time when we spoke about this issue, and I think we talked about 2016, that this wouldn't be an issue in the presidential race in 2016. But do you think that same-sex marriage opponents want it to be an issue in the political realm, or are they content to keep it an issue sort of more at the legal, or perhaps the something that they would talk about in either church or in Bible study or something like that, and in the legal realm, but they don't necessarily want to see politicians talking about it?
I have a hard time seeing the Republicans ever nominating a person who is vocally in favor of traditional marriage. If they have that view, they're going to have to be so quiet about it that it's inconsequential to their candidacy.
Because they wouldn't be able to win the general election.
Yeah, in other words, I think they're going to view that issue as toxic going forward. So I don't see either of the political parties taking up this issue with any kind of vigor at the national level. You'll see it at state offices and statewide offices perhaps, but at the national level, I think you're going to see the party and others regarding this more as a poison pill. I'd like to be wrong on that, but I think that they're just following the demographic trends, which are showing a majority of support for a right to so-called same-sex marriage. So I don't see the national Republicans viewing this as a potent political issue, which, for me as a Christian is, that doesn't change my opinion one bit. I don't hold this view because it helps or hurts the Republicans or the Democrats or whatever. So I don't see it as the potency of that issue for the political party is not what's most concerning to me. I'm most concerning of the common good, what's good for society, and what's good for the sake of the gospel. And the religious liberty implications are huge. I think the redefinition of the family that is among us is not going to be positive for us. It's going to be devastating, and that'll be borne out over time. So those are the things I'm mostly concerned about.
So I know that you teach at a seminary, so obviously you come in contact with a lot of younger people, and I guess millennials, and if you like to use those sorts of categories, and so you probably see a slice of that age group that's probably more conservative on this issue than the population as a whole. Do you get a sense that your students are losing interest in this as a potent issue, or do you think that they have the same, basically that their views are in line with yours? The slice of students that we serve are pretty conservative. They would be more or less in line with what I'm telling to you right now. They would have a priority on traditional marriage for theological reasons, for faith reasons, and so they would be in line with this. But that's not to say that the larger culture and really wider evangelicalism hasn't seen some loosening up on these things. Right. But by and large, evangelicals, you're going to see still maintain a traditional definition of marriage. But the changes in the country are just going to make that more difficult and more difficult to hold on to. I think the issue I'm from the South, and people have typically viewed these issues as regional. So you have the red states in the South, you have the blue states in the coastal right. cities. That's really not the case. It's a generational issue. I think the numbers are, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but about 10 or 15 years ago in the South, same-sex marriage polls at about 80-20. So 80% opposed, 20% for. I think that's about 60-40 now. So it's almost doubled in the South. So it's not, what's happening is it's not a regional thing. It's a generational shift that's going on. And it's even impacting the traditional red states. So this is not going to be a potent issue going forward for Republicans, and precisely because of a generational shift that's going on. So with less popular support for it, do you think that there's still going to be the will to mobilize activists to, say, donate money to organizations that are fighting same-sex marriage, or write letters or do whatever sort of political activism is asked of them by, say, an organization like the National Organization for Marriage? I mean, do you think that they're going to start to see, if they haven't already, a drop-off in support for what they do?
No, I think that for the foreseeable future, they'll have plenty of support to carry on. I will support those efforts. I want to have a public declaration of what we believe marriage is. So I think for the foreseeable future that they'll still be there. I do think that the new cultural situation is going to cause evangelicals and other Christians to go back to the basics of what marriage is, where a lot of these things have been assumed and in some places neglected for a long time. So there's going to be some. I think that the conflict from the outside is going to cause some refinement on the inside. For instance, I think that evangelicals for a generation slid long before there was a debate about gay marriage. There were a lot of churches that were just frankly backsliding on the issue of divorce. And so there was a redefinition of marriage that happened beginning with the onset of no-fault divorce. So that you have a generation of young people who think that marriage is just defined as who you love for as long as you happen to love them. And when you don't love them anymore, you break it off. There's a lot of people who believe that across the country, including people who are growing up in churches. That's a failure on the part of churches to have a robust marriage culture and a robust teaching on what marriage is. So now that we have this particular challenge that's come before us, we're having to go back and basically educate and to sort of renew our commitment to what marriage is. And so that's my concern. I'm a professor at a college. I'm also an associate pastor at my church. And these things are on our front burner all the time.
But, don't you think it's possible for evangelicals to commit themselves to the type of marriage that you're describing, but also not see same-sex marriage as a threat to their own marriage or their own concept of what their marriage is?
Yeah, well, in one sense, nobody's saying that, a gay couple is somehow an immediate threat to my own personal marriage. That's not really what the debate's about. The debate is about how society views this foundational institution, what's going to cause the most human flourishing based on how society defines it. And so, as Christians, we believe there's a certain definition of marriage that promotes the common good. And it protects children. It's for it gives a context in which the rearing of children can happen the best. And so we think that there is a common good sort of element to this that we want to make our case. That's not answering your question. What was the tail end of it?
Well, so I think that there are younger evangelicals who are very committed to the idea of marriage as a lifelong commitment, as opposed to and that wouldn't see same-sex marriage as a threat to that for themselves.
Right. It's not necessarily. I don't think that because gay marriage becomes legal, it's going to end my marriage. As I said before, that's not really what the issue is. It's will marriage be held in high regard in this society? That's what's changing. And if it's not limited to the definition of one man and one woman, it's going to have negative repercussions with the new definition, including gay marriage, and it's probably ultimately going to become elastic. It probably won't stop here with allowing same-sex couples to be married. I don't know if you saw in Kennedy's opinion, but the logic of his opinion, I think, undermines previous United States law that outlawed polygamy. So we'll see if that shoe drops or not. But if you read carefully what Kennedy wrote, it's pretty astonishing. So I don't know that this ends here.
I did not. I will read it again before saying anything about whether on the polygamy point. I'm not sure that jumped out at me when I read it this morning.
Yeah. Well, we'll see. All these things will come out in the wash, and we'll probably have our opinions refined more tomorrow. I know I will.
Right. These are very sort of initial reactions based on reading it pretty quickly. So, well, I guess the last question that I'd like to hear your take on is how there are people who are having very dire reactions to this, and that next is you made a suggestion that maybe next is polygamy, but there's been suggestions that this is around the corner, polygamy, polyamory, whatever. Do you think that framing this in kind of dire, immediate, catastrophic terms is helpful to your position?
No.
Or do you think it causes people to just kind of go, "Oh, you're being hysterical"?
Yeah. I do think that this is a massive revision, and it's on the horizon. I don't feel dire though. I don't feel hopeless. I do think it's going to be a major challenge and a major change, but I'm still hopeful that in the things that are most important, I'm still hopeful about the gospel. I'm still hopeful about the fortunes of the church in the United States society and across the world. So I don't think any Christian, I'm speaking as a Christian now, I don't think any Christian needs to be panicky or hysterical. I think we need to be sober. Mm-hmm. I think we need to be sober about what's on the horizon, and I think that we have some real challenges ahead of us, but they're not existential ones. So we're people who confess the gates of hell won't prevail against us. So there's really no existential threat that we fear from that perspective.
So do you think that the panicky, hysterical reactions to it can possibly be a turnoff to people?
Oh yeah, I'm certainly sure that it is.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah. Well, what would be really interesting is if we could continue to follow this periodically, like we have over the past 2 times we've done this, because it's been really interesting to get your take on it.
Absolutely. It's great talking to you, Sarah, and thanks for inviting me.
Okay. Thanks,
All right.
Denny.
Bye.